After the sinking of the Titanic and the even greater losses of the First World War, the 20th century held still more turbulent times for the world's most successful shipyard. As planes began to conquer the skies, ships were forced to evolve, from floating luxury hotels to devastating war machines, and finally to purely functional cargo carriers. This, coupled with seismic shifts in the global economy, threatened the very existence of the shipbuilders of old. But the greatest of them all, Northern Ireland's Harland and Wolff, had a track record of adapting to survive.
More than once, war would bring renewed demand for even greater tonnages of shipping, as yet again merchant vessels became the focus of attack. And in peacetime, with new opportunities opening up at the other side of the world, passenger ships remained the only way to travel.
In 1918, the Great War was over, and the world breathed a sigh of relief. The cost in human life had been staggering, and as the casualties continued to arrive home, the financial cost began to take its toll. With nearly half the British merchant fleet lost to the U-boats, the demand for standard ships kept Harland and Wolff busy longer than most. But the world's economy was in tatters, and orders started to dry up by the early 1920s. Then, in 1924, Harland and Wolff lost the man who had driven it to the peak of its success. During a visit to South America to explore new shipping prospects, Lord Perry succumbed to bronchial pneumonia aboard the steamship Ebro. His body was brought home on his beloved Olympic, the last survivor of the Titanic and her sisters.
Throughout the recent troubles, the ageing and increasingly dictatorial chairman, Lord Perry, continued to show growing profits. After his death, the next chairman of the yard would discover exactly how he achieved that.
Harland and Wolff was taken over by Owen Cosby Phillips, better known as Baron Kilsent. At 40 years old and standing 6'7" tall, he was also a giant of industry, nicknamed the Lord of the Seven Seas, with interests in over 40 shipping and oil companies.
What Kilsent discovered must have made the blood drain from his cheeks. Perry's accounting system was almost incomprehensible, partly to keep his own management from knowing too much. Far from being in profit, when the books were finally deciphered, they showed a bank deficit of over £500,000.
Kilsent tried everything he could to reverse the company's fortunes, but the cure was worse than the affliction. Wages were slashed, and workers were laid off in their thousands. America's economy was devastated by the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, and soon the rest of the world would follow. Harland and Wolff's workforce tumbled and its debts soared. And yet, inexplicably, Baron Kilsent kept on purchasing companies with money he didn't have, and building ships at losses of up to 10% of their cost.
By 1928, the Lord of the Seven Seas controlled more than 1 in 6 British vessels. But the financial sleight of hand couldn't continue. After years of robbing Peter to pay Paul, Kilsent was forced to resign in 1930, soon to serve a year in jail for the crime of issuing a false prospectus.
Inheriting a bleak and desolate prospect, Harland and Wolff's new chairman took up office in 1930. Sir Frederick Rebick had worked as a designer on the Titanic and possessed a drive and enthusiasm to match Perry and Harland before him. He would lead the company back into profit through 3 decades. But to begin with, he faced an immeasurable task.
It's kind of hard to imagine why anyone would want to be chairman of Harland and Wolff at this particular point in history. Just 12 months into office, there was just one order on the books. And pretty soon, even that would be considered a good year.
In the 2.5 years between December 1931 and May 1934, not a single ship was launched at Queen's Island. For the first time in the company's 80-year history, the slipways stood silent. One of the first ships to break the dry spell was the light cruiser HMS Penelope, the 8th Royal Navy vessel to bear the name. Not only did this symbolise the beginning of a recovery from the Depression, but it also marked the beginning of Britain gearing itself up to do battle. Once again, Germany was on the rise. Just as Harland and Wolff faced almost certain closure, it seemed fate had other plans for both the shipyard and the world. Less than 2 decades after the war to end all wars had officially ended, Germany had a new leader with a new and terrifying vision of a world empire. And this time, he appeared unstoppable. Some historians argue that the 2 world wars were really a single conflict, separated by a temporary ceasefire.
Certainly, for Harland and Wolff, the Second World War played out very much like the First. Once again, Winston Churchill was in charge of the fleet, this time as Prime Minister. And once again, he ordered a squadron of dummy ships, which proved hopelessly ineffective. But like the First World War, the German U-boats were the major threat at sea in a totally unrestricted campaign, sinking hundreds of tons of merchant ships and fueling a need for replacement tonnage. The Belfast shipyards were back in business, and in Harland and Wolff, under Sir Frederick Rebick, the workforce almost tripled during this war.
Among the most famous of the World War II ships was the great battle cruiser HMS Belfast. Named after the city that built her and launched on St. Patrick's Day 1938, she also had the distinction of being Harland and Wolff's 1,000th ship.
Almost immediately, HMS Belfast's war career was cut short. Barely 2 months into the Second World War, she struck a mine in the Firth of Forth and was almost 3 years in recovery. While she was out of action, it was up to other ships from Belfast to take up the fight and to leave their mark.
HMS Penelope, the ship that symbolised Harland and Wolff's change of fortune after the Depression, had a particularly busy war career, with an incredible catalogue of lucky escapes. An aerial barrage from more than 200 of Hitler's bombers left her with so many shrapnel wounds that she was nicknamed HMS Pepperpot. Such was the plucky nature of both the ship and her crew that her report simply read, "Nothing serious, more frightened than hurt." C.S. Forrester's novel The Ship tells the story of the fictional HMS Artemis, based on just one of Penelope's heroic outings. But sadly, HMS Penelope didn't quite make it to the end of the war. In 1944, she was attacked by a U-boat, taking more than 400 men down with her, including her captain. And HMS Glorious, the fatally flawed World War I battlecruiser, was given a new lease of life after her one disappointing performance in the previous war. Her large hull and high speed made her ideal for an entirely new role, one that had only recently evolved.
After a refit costing considerably more than £2 million, HMS Glorious proudly re-entered service as an aircraft carrier.
The aircraft carrier Glorious is preparing to fly off her aircraft in a mock attack on a battleship. These huge floating aerodromes are among the most recent of the Navy's weapons.
These flat tops were a truly British innovation. Floating air bases that could bring another new species of weapon, the warplane, to any country within reach of the sea. And the reborn Glorious was one of the very first.
Glorious served in the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean, but it was in the freezing waters off Norway that she finally had a chance to live up to her name. There, she played a vital part in Operation Alphabet, the evacuation of Allied forces from Norway and Denmark after the Nazis had invaded to, in their words, protect their neutrality.
It was on the way back from this operation, less than a year into the war, that Glorious met her end. The carrier and her 2 destroyer escorts were sailing home through the Norwegian Sea when they were intercepted by 2 powerful German battle cruisers. All 3 British ships were sunk, with the loss of 1,519 men. A death toll almost identical to the Titanic's. Glorious was to become the only large carrier ever sunk by surface ships.
But it was this ship, Harland and Wolff, number 1000, that was to have the last word after the loss of the Glorious.
Unidades da Marinha de Guerra Alemã, entre elas os couraçados Scharnhorst e Gneisenau, avançam, os alemães conseguem descobrir.
The German battle cruisers that sank the Glorious were called the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau, named after their predecessors in World War I. Known to the Allies as the Ugly Sisters, they were among Germany's most successful surface vessels, causing endless havoc for the British throughout the Second World War.
By 1943, the Gneisenau was on dry dock for repairs due to mine damage. But the Scharnhorst, one of the most formidable warships in the Nazi inventory, was still at large.
On Boxing Day 1943, the Scharnhorst was lurking in the icy waters off Norway, actively looking for trouble. She had sent her 4 destroyers off to hunt down a British convoy. But the convoy, escorted by more than half a dozen British destroyers, spotted the now unprotected Scharnhorst first.
The Battle of North Cape is thought to be one of the most northerly naval battles in history. Fought over 10 hours and hundreds of miles of ocean, it involved no less than 20 ships, but it was HMS Belfast and the battleship Duke of York that were to be instrumental in the destruction of the Scharnhorst. Of nearly 2,000 German sailors on board, only 36 were dragged from the freezing water.
As for HMS Belfast, she went on to become one of the most successful and famous ships ever built by Harland and Wolff. Among the very first vessels to open fire on the German positions at Normandy, she played a crucial role in the D-Day landings, fighting there for 5 weeks solid. By the time she was retired here as a museum piece in 1971, she had clocked up an incredible 500,000 miles at sea. But despite the continuing importance of the naval fleet, the role of the warship in World War II was giving way to that of the warplane. The focus of direct engagement had shifted from the seas to the sky. With Germany controlling France's airfields, Belfast was no longer safe in isolation from attack, and it became one of the heaviest casualties of the Blitz bombings of April and May 1941.
Protestants from the nearby Shankill Road sheltered alongside Catholics down here in the crypt of Clonard Monastery as German Luftwaffe planes destroyed or seriously damaged over half the homes in Belfast, killing more than 1,000 people and leaving almost a quarter of the city's population homeless.
As an important strategic target, the shipyard suffered serious damage. Luftwaffe bombers attacked in repeated waves of 5 at a time. Along with several ships and all the company records, nearly 2/3 of the premises were wiped out. It took almost 2 years for production to resume again. Belfast's contribution to the war effort had been enormous. In total, Queen's Island launched 170 Admiralty and merchant ships during the 6 years of the Second World War, as well as repairing or converting 30,000 more. On top of that, it produced more than 500 tanks, thousands of large guns, and 13 million aircraft parts.
If planes brought destruction during wartime, they continued to wreak havoc in the decades ahead as commercial airlines brought the passenger ship business to its knees. Harland and Wolff had survived disaster, 2 world wars, and a depression. But its greatest challenge was yet to come.
As memories of the war started to fade, people once again dared to embrace the future with a newfound optimism. The 1950s saw the arrival of rock and roll and the teenager in America, and the rest of the West soon followed suit. The world was changing fast, not least due to the arrival of passenger planes, which would eventually come to dominate commercial travel.
It's not that Harland and Wolff or indeed any other British shipyard stopped building ships, far from it. In fact, in the 3 years after the war, they topped the World League table for shipping output, and the ships they were building would soon be on a scale that would absolutely dwarf the Titanic. But whilst these ships were massive, interesting they were not.
Only a few decades earlier, the yard had employed hundreds of cabinet makers, glass engravers, French polishers, not so much labourers as craftsmen and artists. Now, it was all about heavy industry, transporting oil and cargo to the far corners of the earth, and most ships were no longer required to be things of beauty.
But then there's always the exception that proves the rule.
In 1956, Harland and Wolff won its biggest contract to date, and once again it was a passenger liner, only slightly smaller than the Titanic and her sisters. 6 months after the keel was laid at Queen's Island, the massive P&O ship still had no name. But by the time she was launched in 1960, that had been put right.
I named this ship Canberra. May God protect her and all who sail in her.
Above all else, the Canberra was a beautiful ship. She was launched just as the space race was about to take off, and it showed. Her sleek lines and bold curves were revolutionary at the time, and she'd look futuristic even today. But the original concept was even more extraordinary.
P&O's designer, John West, had intended the ship's upper decks to be an entirely open affair, constructed almost completely out of glass. It was a visionary concept for the late 50s, before such radical ideas became an essential part of today's landmark architecture. For ship design, though, this was a step too far.
Canberra was destined for the other side of the world, and that meant passing through the shallow Suez Canal. But with that amount of glass, Harland and Wolff's designers knew she'd be far too heavy for that. In a masterstroke of compromise, they put forward the idea of building the superstructure out of aluminium. 1,200 tons of it.
Nothing like it had been attempted on such a scale before. The entire aluminium shell had to be welded to the conventional steel hull, but the two metals have completely different heat characteristics, which could lead to warps or cracks. Brand new welding techniques were developed to avoid the very real possibility of the passenger liner cracking open in the middle of the ocean. Almost half a century may have passed, but nobody had forgotten the Titanic.
The new technology was a complete success. Although she still had a deep draft, the extra saving in weight meant the Canberra could pass safely through the Suez Canal, and with an extra 200 cabins into the bargain. Like the best hotels of the day, all 15 decks were fully air-conditioned, and nearly all cabins had their own showers and bathrooms. This was clearly a ship that was designed to appeal to the jet set, and with good reason.
Commercial airliners, many of them with powerful jet propulsion engines that need no propellers, can take passengers anywhere in the world in a matter of hours.
By 1960, the jet age had well and truly arrived. Suddenly, New York was only hours away from London, and everybody wanted to fly. Airline pilots were treated like matinee idols, and every little girl dreamed of becoming an air stewardess. Travel by jet plane was glamorous. It was exciting. It was the future.
But in 1960, air travel was far too expensive to be anything but a luxury to most people. And this was especially true of long journeys, where numerous stopovers drove costs up even further. And in 1960, plenty of people had a long way to go.
Canberra's magnificence, by the way, was well matched by the...
Migration to Australia and New Zealand was at an all-time high. And if flying was too expensive, a trip on the Canberra was easily the next best thing. Her looks might have belonged to the future, but Canberra's function couldn't have been more like that of her Olympic predecessors. A ship of dreams to carry Europe's immigrants to a new life in a new world. The Canberra's maiden voyage on Friday, the 2nd of June, 1961, saw her set sail for Sydney with a full complement of more than 2,200 passengers.
Almost half were emigrating to Australia and New Zealand, with a high proportion of these coming from Northern Ireland, a trend that was set to continue for years to come. As with all migrations, complex social and economic forces were driving the exodus, but soon one factor in particular would come to dominate all others.
Growing sectarian tensions within the province began to erupt in the mid-60s and quickly escalated into the most bloody and violent period in the region's history. Catholics demanding equal civil rights were pitted against fearful and angry Protestants, and for the first time since World War II, British troops patrolled the streets. Not since Hitler's Luftwaffe bombings had Northern Ireland witnessed such scenes of utter destruction. But this was different. This came from within.
Harland and Wolff, with its overwhelmingly Protestant workforce, couldn't help but be affected. Absenteeism rose, and the traditionally good working atmosphere was put under strain. But for the most part, the shipyard walls acted as a protective barrier, keeping the worst of the hatred outside at bay, at least whilst there was work to be done. And at the time, there was plenty of that.
Driven by an exponential rise in the global demand for oil, ship designs had grown even larger, far in excess of anything dreamed of by the men behind the Titanic. Company chairman Sir Frederick Rebick had wisely ensured that the yard's facilities kept ahead of demand. No shipyard in Britain was better equipped to construct these floating leviathans, but by the mid-60s, even Harland and Wolff had reached their limit. When Shell Oil placed an order for an oil tanker named the Marina, weighing 190,000 tonnes, it was Britain's first supertanker and the biggest ship built in all of Europe in the 60s. The existing slipways simply weren't physically big enough to take the whole ship at once. So the stern was built first, leaving a gaping hole at the other end where the bow should be.
The only way to finish the job was to slide the completed half, stern first, into the water and then stop it before it sank. Now, getting 100,000 tonnes of metal on the move in the first place is one thing. Stopping it was an entirely different matter. One senior engineer was asked, "What will we do if it didn't stop?" And his answer was simple: run.
The operation was successful, but it highlighted the need for still larger facilities. With even bigger orders on the horizon and the backing of government funds to the tune of £8 million, the decision was made to supersize the building dock at Queen's Island. At more than 1,800 feet long, this was yet another world beater. To give you some idea of just how spectacularly big it is, if the world's tallest building, Taiwan's Taipei Financial Center, was laid on its side, it could easily fit inside this dock with room for at least a dozen more stories. The concrete floor alone is 10 feet thick, and the entire structure is capable of floating a ship weighing 1 million tons. But the most impressive features straddling the colossal dock are the mighty Samson and Goliath.
Like most people that grew up in Belfast over the last half-century, I regard these giant cranes as iconic landmarks that more than any other symbolise our city. These are our Sydney Opera House, our Eiffel Tower, and at over 35 stories high, Samson here is taller than Westminster's Big Ben clock tower.
And if that wasn't impressive enough, these monumental structures can do something that Big Ben never could. They move.
You get a fantastic view of Belfast from up here, including the Waterfront Hall and the Odyssey Arena, often hailed as marvels of Belfast technical design and innovation. But these are nothing compared with what went on here in the 60s and 70s, often unseen and unappreciated outside the walls of the shipyard.
While the first of the cranes was under construction, the rest of the immense expansion programme was still being carried on around it. At the same time, shipbuilding continued in full force, with ships like the 125,000-ton Eulydia taking shape at one end of the dock, while Goliath grew into the Belfast skyline at the other.
Harland and Wolff's massive building dock was and is the greatest feat of civil engineering in Northern Irish history. And the fact that at the same time and the same place they were building some of the world's largest ships is simply astonishing.
And let's not forget the Seaquest, the biggest oil drilling rig of her time, built as a single structure and launched down 3 separate slipways at once. Experts, like the Japanese, said it couldn't be done, claiming it would topple over when it hit the water. But through sheer technical brilliance, the island men proved them all wrong. The gamble paid off in more ways than one, when Seaquest made the first commercial oil find in the North Sea, a discovery which had a huge impact on the fortunes of Britain in the decades that followed. By the mid-70s, even with British shipbuilding in decline, optimism at the yard seemed boundless. Prospects over the last decade had been so good that the self-made Greek shipping tycoon, Aristotle Onassis, not unlike J.P. Morgan before him, had acquired a substantial stake of almost a third of the shipyard. There were even fears of a takeover bid, and while that never happened, he did order ships that broke the 250,000-ton barrier.
This frenzy of shipbuilding culminated with the coastal Corpus Christi and her sister ship, launched in 1977. At a third of 1 million tons each, they were the biggest ships ever built in Belfast, more than 7 times the size of the Titanic. At the time, they were seen as just one more step towards that first 1 million ton order, but the order never came.
The oil crisis of 1973 changed everything. Fallout from the Arab-Israeli conflict had sent oil prices skyrocketing, after supplies to many Western nations were withheld. As the petrol pumps ran dry and queues grew longer, interest rates shot up and the economy of the West was thrown into disarray. Coinciding with this were factors such as growing competition from Japan and Korea, as well as the environmental outcry over the supersize oil spills that became a hallmark of the jumbo supertankers. The risks began to outweigh the benefits, and demand suddenly plummeted. One by one, Britain's shipyards began either to close or merge, and while Harland and Wolff managed to hold on, they also had to carry the huge cost of their recent redevelopment. Job losses were inevitable, and the shrinking workforce soon found itself immersed in the wage disputes and industrial strikes of Britain's winter of discontent.
The failure of the Labour government under Jim Callaghan to contain the many trade union strikes probably cost them the election of 1979. But Britain's next Prime Minister was made of sterner stuff.
This government is pursuing the only policy which gives any hope of bringing our people back to real and lasting employment.
Margaret Thatcher led the country with an iron fist, showing no mercy towards Britain's unprofitable industries. The infamous miners' strike of 84-85 would be the ultimate proof of that. Bitterly fought over the course of a year, the dispute divided the country and eventually shattered the power of the trade unions, resulting in the closure of most of the country's coal mines. Despite the devastating consequences, Thatcher had stood firm.
It was this uncompromising and true blue stoicism that would lead the Iron Lady into yet another showdown, one that would have unforeseen and not entirely welcome consequences for Belfast's last passenger ship.
By 1982, the Canberra's role had changed. Jumbo jets had finally seen off the last of the ocean liners, and after narrowly escaping the scrapyard, she found a new niche as a cruise ship. It was on the final leg of a world cruise, as she made her way through the Mediterranean, that the ship received a curious message from head office, asking her to rendezvous with a small boat in the Strait of Gibraltar.
As the passengers continued sunning themselves around the pools on deck, a group of men boarded the ship to inform the crew of, as they put it, an interesting assignment. The men were British commandos and Admiralty officials, and the assignment was the Falklands. Britain and the Canberra were going to war.
In a shock move in March 1982, Argentinian forces invaded a remote surviving possession of a once extensive British Empire, known to them as Las Malvinas. A Royal Navy task force was dispatched, and the Canberra was called upon to act as a troop carrier, just like the Olympic in the First World War. Back in Southampton, as soon as her payload of tourists had disembarked, her conversion began.
After just 3 days, the luxury liner was ready for war and set sail for the South Atlantic.
It was here that she was christened the Great White Whale. There were fears that her massive white paintwork would make her an easy target. Ironically, the often hazy conditions around the Falklands made her much less visible than many of her naval companions, and the unrivaled height of her bridge offered the perfect vantage point from which to spot an enemy approach. When she entered San Carlos water to begin disembarking her 2,500 troops, she repeatedly came under attack from Argentine aircraft. HMS Ardent was sunk, and HMS Argonaut damaged in these attacks. But somehow, Canberra escaped unharmed. During the conflict, she served alongside another Harland and Wolff ship, completed shortly after the Canberra. HMS Fearless, the Royal Navy's first purpose-built amphibious landing platform dock, was the command ship for the entire Falklands operation. She was also where Major General Jeremy Moore flew from, with dirt on his face and a rip in his trousers, to meet Argentinian commander Mario Menendez in order to co-sign the formal instrument of the Argentinian surrender. 5-month conflict had been the heaviest and longest series of naval battles since World War II.
3/4 of the British task force were hit by either Argentine aircraft or Exocet missiles, with a total of 5 seriously damaged or sunk. Incredibly, the great white whale emerged with barely a scratch.
On her return to Southampton, she received a war hero's welcome. She continued for many more years as a cruise ship until her final voyage in 1997, when the decision was made to scrap one of the most popular ships in history. By then, Harland and Wolff was a shadow of its former self. Hopes had been briefly raised when plans for the world's largest cruise ship, the Ultimate Dream, reached the design stage in the late 80s. There was even a revival of the scheme as recently as 2001, but again, the order never came to pass. In more ways than one, the project was just that, a dream. And now, the dream was over. Which brings us back to the launch of the Anvil Point in 2003. Widely reported as the last ship ever built by Harland and Wolff.
True, there hasn't been a launch here since, and we may never see the likes of the Canberra or the Titanic again, but who knows what the future may hold for the most famous shipyard in the world.
In a post-September the 11th world, travel by plane has suddenly lost its glamorous image. Delays, cancellations, and endless security searches may yet drive people back to the calm, luxury, and legroom offered at sea. Then there's the environmental cost, prompting green taxes designed to discourage unnecessary air travel. The days of rock-bottom economy flights may already be numbered. Even if that never happens, it could highlight another way forward for the Belfast shipyard. The same environmental issues that threaten the airlines have given rise to the new engineering challenges of giant tidal and wind turbines. Already a major player in this expanding field, Harland and Wolff has seen its workforce triple since it said goodbye to the Anvil Point. The British government recently announced plans for a massive 60-fold increase in offshore wind energy. And so, the Belfast shipbuilders may be poised to change the world yet again, this time not by conquering the sea, but by harnessing the air.